Let your mind drift for a moment, as if you're standing beneath the quiet glow of the Black Lake, where the water holds centuries of whispers. Tonight, we step into the lore of Slytherin, not merely a house of ambition, but a philosophy forged through conflict, secrecy, and survival. Together, we'll unravel Salazar Slytherin's selective doctrine, the hidden architecture he left behind, and the lineage that shaped the politics of the wizarding world. Why create a safeguard instead of a legacy? And is ambition truly darkness, or simply untamed power? If you enjoy these journeys, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is, and the topics you'd love to explore. Your thoughts may guide our next adventure. Let your breathing settle and imagine the world as it was 1,000 years ago, long before the portraits lined the corridors of Hogwarts, before the Sorting Hat sang its first song. The wizarding world lived in a state of quiet fear. It was the year 990 AD, a time when magic was hunted, misunderstood, and forced into the shadows. Witches and wizards survived by caution, secrets, and the instinct to protect their own. And it was in this climate of uncertainty that Salazar Slytherin formed his philosophy. While Gryffindor saw courage as a shield, Hufflepuff saw unity as strength, and Ravenclaw sought knowledge for its own sake. Slytherin viewed the world like a grand chessboard, where every move carried consequence, and every mistake might cost a life. To him, survival depended not on idealism, but on strategy. Slytherin was a master of ancient magic, spells predating the standardized incantations that later defined wizarding education. His connection to Parseltongue, a rare linguistic inheritance tied to serpent magic, placed him in communion with forces most feared and least understood. While some saw darkness in that gift, Slytherin saw clarity, an ability to communicate with what others fled from. To him, knowledge was never light or dark, it was simply a tool, shaped by the intention of the one who wielded it. From this worldview emerged his most defining belief, power preservation philosophy. Slytherin observed that not all witches and wizards shared equal discipline, restraint, or understanding. Magic, wild, ancient, and unpredictable, could be destructive in the wrong hands. And so he asked a question that would echo across centuries. Should magic be taught freely, or should it be granted to those prepared for its weight? His answer became the foundation of the selective education doctrine. Contrary to later legend, this doctrine was not born from hatred of Muggle-born witches and wizards. In its original form, it argued that access to advanced magical knowledge should be earned, not assumed, that students needed the temperament, capability, and judgment to handle spells capable of reshaping the world. Slytherin feared misuse, not ancestry, chaos, not diversity. But as history tends to do, his ideas were simplified, misinterpreted, and weaponized long after he was gone. And yet, the Sorting Hat still remembers the traits he prized most. Not purity of blood, but ambition, the quiet fire that pushes one toward possibility. Resourcefulness, the ability to survive even when the odds turn hostile. Strategic intelligence, a foresight sharpened by caution and calculation. And adaptability, the instinct to shift shape, change course, and evolve with the tides of destiny. These were the qualities Slytherin sought, not merely in his students, but in the future of the magical world itself. To him, greatness was not a moral category, it was a form of potential. And while potential may rise toward brilliance or fall into ruin, it remains above all power waiting for direction. So as we drift deeper into this world, remember, Slytherin's legacy did not begin with division. It began with fear, wisdom, and a desire to protect magic from disappearing forever. And in that desire lay the seed of everything that followed. At its center stands a monument so colossal it blots out the sky, a statue of Superman, sculpted in obsidian alloy, rising higher than the former Daily Planet building. In his outstretched hand, he holds a burning globe, an eternal sphere of crimson fire representing Earth purified by order. At night, the flame illuminates the skyline like a second sun, casting long, obedient shadows across the towers below. No one questions it. No one looks away. The statue is not just art. It is a declaration, a promise, a warning. The architecture of New Olympus is unlike anything that existed before the rise of the regime. The buildings fuse myth with machine. White marble columns reminiscent of ancient temples spiraling upward within titanium frameworks. The domes are patterned after the star crest of Krypton, etched with runic circuitry that pulses faintly beneath the surface, as if the city itself were alive. And everywhere, from rooftop to boulevard, red laser beams sweep silently across the horizon, projected from orbital satellites, watching every soul below. The result is a landscape that feels both divine and mechanical, holy and suffocating. Imagine a city that once breathed with chaos and life, now transformed into something vast, silent, and monumental. In this new era, Metropolis is no longer a city. It is an empire carved in steel, marble, and fear. Its heart is a place the regime calls New Olympus, a district built to symbolize the birth of a perfected world and the death of the old one. Below each eye beacon, etched in shimmering silver text, are the mantras of the new age. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of New Olympus is its visual order, the way every street, every alleyway, and every public square is designed to funnel attention toward the regime's symbols. At every intersection stand the eye beacons, tall, mask-like structures shaped as a single, unblinking eye. They hum softly as they scan emotional signatures, analyzing stress levels, dissent, and unregistered anxiety. Standing beneath them gives the uncanny sensation of being judged by something ancient and all-seeing. Peace through power. Imagine a city that once breathed with chaos and life, now transformed into something vast, silent, and monumental. In this new era, Metropolis is no longer a city. It is an empire carved in steel, marble, and fear. Its heart is a place the regime calls New Olympus, a district built to symbolize the birth of a perfected world and the death of the old one. At its center stands a monument so colossal it blots out the sky, a statue of Superman, sculpted in obsidian alloy, rising higher than the former Daily Planet building. In his outstretched hand, he holds a burning globe, an eternal sphere of crimson fire representing Earth purified by order. At night, the flame illuminates the skyline like a second sun, casting long, obedient shadows across the towers below. No one questions it. No one looks away. The statue is not just art. It is a declaration, a promise, a warning. The architecture of New Olympus is unlike anything that existed before the rise of the regime. The buildings fuse myth with machine. White marble columns reminiscent of ancient temples spiraling upward within titanium frameworks. The domes are patterned after the star crest of Krypton, etched with runic circuitry that pulses faintly beneath the surface, as if the city itself were alive. And everywhere, from rooftop to boulevard, red laser beams sweep silently across the horizon, projected from orbital satellites, watching every soul below. The result is a landscape that feels both divine and mechanical, holy and suffocating. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of New Olympus is its visual order, the way every street, every alleyway, and every public square is designed to funnel attention toward the regime's symbols. At every intersection stand the eye beacons, tall, mask-like structures shaped as a single, unblinking eye. They hum softly as they scan emotional signatures, analyzing stress levels, dissent, and unregistered anxiety. Standing beneath them gives the uncanny sensation of being judged by something ancient and all-seeing. Below each eye beacon, etched in shimmering silver text, are the mantras of the new age. Peace through power, trust in the man of tomorrow. They repeat in perfect symmetry throughout the district, forming a rhythm, an architecture of obedience. And then there is the sound, or rather, the absence of sound. New Olympus does not echo with the usual symphony of urban life. There are no honking horns, no crowds, no restless noise of commerce. Instead, the city moves with synchronized quiet, as if every citizen has learned to breathe at the same pace. The only auditory presence is the morning broadcast, a calm, steady voice rising from the city's central speakers, the safety manifesto, recited daily as both prayer and command. Safety is peace, peace is order, order is strength. Trust the man of tomorrow. In New Olympus, silence is not the absence of chaos, it is the presence of absolute control. This is the world shaped by a single figure, one who saved mankind once and then reshaped it in his own image. This is the heart of the empire, and it never stops watching. We must first abandon the stories told by frightened students and misinformed historians. The chamber was never designed as a weapon, nor as a tomb for innocent blood. It was, instead, the purest expression of Salazar Slytherin's worldview, a space built not for violence, but for preservation, a sanctuary of ideology, a contingency plan for a future he feared, yet foresaw. Imagine descending into its depths, the air cooling, the stone shifting, the ancient magic vibrating faintly underfoot. Nothing about the chamber feels like a battlefield. It feels like an archive, silent, deliberate, and waiting. Slytherin did not carve it out of rage, but out of caution. He believed that Hogwarts, like all institutions, would evolve with the tides of history, and he feared that evolution might one day dilute the very principles on which he built the school. So he created the chamber as a vault, not for bodies, but for beliefs. The basilisk, often depicted as a monster, is in truth a symbol far older than Hogwarts itself. To Slytherin, it embodied dormant power, strength so immense it must sleep until awakened by someone capable of bearing its weight. The creature's existence was never meant to terrorize students or wage war. It was a metaphysical test, a mirror held up to the soul of any who dared descend into the chamber. To awaken the basilisk is to reveal oneself, not as a tyrant, and not as a hero, but as someone who has chosen consciously to disturb a force that does not tolerate uncertainty. Only those with clarity of purpose, steadiness of mind, and an unwavering sense of responsibility could claim such a choice. And that is the heart of Slytherin's design. The chamber is not a reward, nor is it a curse. It is a filter. The ability to speak Parseltongue may open the door, but it does not unlock the chamber's true inheritance. That inheritance belongs only to those aligned with Slytherin's core philosophy, that knowledge must be earned, that power must be guided, and that leadership requires restraint, not hunger. Those who seek the chamber out of ambition alone will find themselves overwhelmed by the enormity of what sleeps inside. But those who enter with intention, with understanding, discover something else entirely, a space not built to destroy the unworthy, but to illuminate the worthy, to show whether a person grasps the true cost of command. In this way, the chamber separates pretenders from successors. Hungry, it does not kill. It reveals. For Salazar Slytherin did not trust the future to sentiment or legacy. He trusted it to choice, to the moment when an individual stands before a sleeping power and decides not whether they can wield it, but whether they should. The chamber, then, is not a monument to fear. It is a question, a final, quiet question left for a distant generation. Who are you when no one is watching, and what will you awaken when you answer? Disagreement transformed into mythology. Students whispered embellished versions to frighten first years. Storytellers dramatized the Chamber of Secrets until it grew into a monstrous labyrinth designed for slaughter. In reality, the chamber was never meant to be a weapon. It was a philosophical construct, a sanctuary for ideas. Slytherin believed might one day be orphaned, but fear makes poor historians, and gossip makes eager sculptors. As generations passed, the chamber became a ghost story, and Slytherin a convenient antagonist. History, like magic, is shaped by the hands of those who tell it, and when we peel back the layers surrounding Salazar Slytherin, we find not a villain carved in stone, but a man whose legacy was fractured by conflict, fear, and centuries of convenient mistranslation. To understand the truth, we must step away from legend and return to the moment when everything changed. The divide between Salazar Slytherin and Godric Gryffindor. Most stories paint their argument as a battle between good and evil. Gryffindor the noble defender, Slytherin the oppressive authoritarian. But the real conflict was far more nuanced. Their dispute did not revolve around the question of whom to destroy, but whom to teach. In an age where magical persecution ran rampant, Slytherin feared that reckless expansion of Hogwarts could expose the school to outside threats. His caution, though misinterpreted, came from the instinct to protect the fragile sanctuary they had built. Gryffindor believed in open courage. Slytherin believed in protective discernment. Neither was wrong, but fear, once ignited, has a way of rewriting the story. Folk legends only deepened the distortion. Each era added layers of exaggeration, painting Slytherin as a sinister figure whose every action served malevolent ends. By the time Voldemort rose to power, the connection was too tempting for society to resist. Suddenly, Slytherin was no longer a founder with complex beliefs. He was the progenitor of darkness, blamed for crimes committed centuries after his death. It didn't matter that these accusations lacked evidence. History often prefers the version that fits the mood of the moment. This is how history transforms a philosopher into a monster, through repetition, fear, and the human habit of simplifying complexity into archetypes. Over time, the man disappeared, replaced by a shadow shaped by prejudice and convenience. And yet, when we look closer, the truth becomes clearer. Slytherin was a realist living in an unforgiving age. He understood the fragility of magical society and sought to safeguard it from destruction. His selective doctrine, though controversial, was rooted in survival, not malice. But political tides shifted, ideologies evolved, and the narrative needed a villain. Slytherin became that villain, not because of who he was, but because of what the world needed him to symbolize. Slytherin's architecture was never an engine of hatred. It was a cultural cipher, a code meant to preserve ideas in uncertain times. The chamber was never a tool for murder. It was a test of character and intention. And so we arrive at the true conclusion of this layer. And the myth survived, not because it was true, but because it was useful. In the end, history did not reveal him, it concealed him. And Slytherin himself was never the tyrant stories made him out to be. He was simply the cautionary voice drowned out by the louder chorus of fear. To understand Slytherin's influence on the wizarding world, one must look far beyond the house itself. Its legacy did not end in the sorting ceremony, nor in the underground chambers hidden beneath Hogwarts. Instead, it permeated bloodlines, carved itself into family crests, and shaped the aristocratic backbone of magical society for centuries. In the world of wizarding nobility, Slytherin became less a school affiliation and more a political doctrine, a map for survival, ambition, and authority. The most direct inheritors of Slytherin's ideology were the Gaunts, a family that clung fiercely to Salazar's original philosophies. They guarded the lineage with such intensity that it eventually consumed them. What began as a desire to preserve power became an obsession with purity, leading to the family's tragic decline. Yet even in their ruin, the Gaunts demonstrated the enduring force of Slytherin's ideas, the belief that heritage held responsibility, not privilege. The Black family, by contrast, embodied nobility at its most complex. To the outside world, they were paragons of pure-blood prestige, staunch traditionalists draped in elegance and old magic. But the Blacks were never monolithic. Even within their strict structure were rebels, visionaries, and contradictions. Some upheld the old ways, others fractured them, yet they all grew from the same root, a culture steeped in Slytherin's principles of lineage, influence, and calculated power. The Rosiers, Lestranges, and Yaxleys represented another facet of Slytherin's legacy, the governing class. These families understood that power was not simply inherited, it was negotiated, cultivated, and secured through alliances. They treated Slytherin's doctrine as a handbook, a guide to social architecture. To them, cunning was not a flaw, but a refinement. Strategy was not deceit, but a necessary art. In the political arena of the wizarding world, they moved like seasoned players, navigating laws, councils, and ministries with the precision of those trained from birth to shape outcomes. Central to this noble culture was a shared hierarchy of values. Leadership was not merely encouraged, it was expected. Children in these families were raised with the understanding that the magical world was held together by structure, discipline, and respect for the old magics. They were taught that knowledge must be earned and wielded responsibly, and that the strength of a community came from its most capable members, not its most numerous. It was a worldview that emphasized quality over quantity, discernment over impulse. Their relationship with the dark arts was equally nuanced. Contrary to popular belief, these families did not pursue forbidden magic out of malice. They approached it the way scholars approach dangerous texts, carefully, strategically, and often in the name of protection. To them, the dark arts were a frontier of magical understanding, a domain too powerful to ignore simply because it frightened others. Restraint, not recklessness, distinguished the noble Slytherin approach. Above all, Slytherin nobility fostered a cultural mindset. The world is a chessboard of layered intentions. Every action carries weight. Every alliance shapes the future. Children raised in this tradition learned early that influence was both a weapon and a responsibility. And so, across centuries, Slytherin evolved from a Hogwarts house into something far greater, a cultural code, a political compass, a framework through which the wizarding elite interpreted the world. It did not simply shape students, it shaped the very architecture of wizarding society. Power in the wizarding world has never been evenly distributed. It pools quietly, predictably, around those who know how to understand it, direct it, and survive it. And for centuries, witches and wizards bearing the mark of Slytherin have found themselves at the center of that current, shaping decisions at the highest levels of magical society. In the Ministry of Magic, Slytherin representation has always been striking, not because they were handed authority, but because their upbringing conditioned them for positions where foresight, discipline, and political fluency were essential. They gravitated naturally toward departments where long-term strategy mattered most. Legislation, where laws could be shaped before conflicts arose. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, especially the divisions dedicated to countering the dark arts. Magical Intelligence, where covert observation and subtle intervention protected the wizarding world without fanfare, and regulatory agencies for magical creatures, where diplomacy and restraint carried as much weight as raw power. These roles require individuals who can read not just the situation, but the systems beneath it. And that is where Slytherin thrives, in the quiet architecture of influence, where the future is built decision by decision. But their reach extends far beyond politics. Within the research institutions of the wizarding world, those libraries, laboratories, and arcane workshops, Slytherins have long stood at the forefront of studying ancient and volatile forms of magic. Their contributions appear most prominently in fields often misunderstood. Forbidden magic, where they map boundaries rather than blindly cross them. Magical genetics, investigating how lineage shapes ability and resilience. Energy interaction theory, probing the mechanics of spell construction and magical force. These fields are dangerous, not because they tempt darkness, but because they demand precision, an understanding of where power bends and where it breaks. Slytherin scholars approach them with calculated respect, refusing to treat magic as a simple tool. They study its rifts, its fractures, and its hidden laws. Yet it is impossible to explore Slytherin's role in society without confronting the shadows that cling to their name. The association between Slytherin and dark movements did not begin with Voldemort, but he amplified it beyond repair. His ideology was not the inheritance of Salazar Slytherin. It was the weaponization of a single distorted fragment of it. Voldemort took the idea of selective power and twisted it into absolutism, turning caution into cruelty and foresight into domination. Many dark wizards followed him not because Slytherin teachings demanded it, but because the regime he built promised order through fear, an illusion deeply tempting to those who misunderstood true power. But history rarely honors the Slytherins who resisted him, those who infiltrated his ranks as double agents, those who protected students in silence, those who saw his crusade not as destiny, but as the collapse of everything Slytherin stood for. Their names are quieter but no less significant. For this is the truth at the core of Slytherin influence. It produces individuals of consequence, not alignment. Their strength, ambition, strategy, adaptability can elevate or devastate, depending on the will of the one who wields them. In the end, the house does not dictate morality. It offers a mirror, and the path that follows depends not on Slytherin itself, but on the choices of those who dare to grasp its power. Power in the wizarding world rarely rises suddenly. It gathers in currents shaped by centuries of culture, education, and quiet ambition. And for as long as the Ministry of Magic has existed, the fingerprints of Slytherin have marked its highest chambers. Not as a conspiracy, nor as a shadow government, but as a natural consequence of a house that cultivates strategy, discipline, and an unflinching understanding of how systems function. Within the Ministry, Slytherins appear where the stakes are highest. You'll find them drafting legislation, sculpting the laws that determine the boundaries of magical life. You'll find them embedded deep within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, especially among those tasked with countering the dark arts. Those who know that understanding danger is the first step toward containing it. Down in the intelligence divisions, Slytherins move through diplomatic channels and covert networks, gathering quiet information long before crises reach the public. And in the departments overseeing magical creatures sometimes older and wiser than humans themselves, Slytherins excel in careful negotiation, recognizing that raw force rarely tames ancient power. These placements are not accidental. Their education, both cultural and academic, primes them to read political landscapes the way others read weather. They anticipate shifts, manipulate outcomes, and navigate conflict with a precision that makes them invaluable in leadership, sometimes feared, always necessary. But their influence extends beyond governance. In the research institutions of the wizarding world, Slytherins have pursued forms of magic most fear to touch. They probe the fault lines of ancient spells, map the laws governing magical inheritance, and study the volatile physics of magical energy. They are pioneers of the forbidden, not in the sense of breaking rules, but in understanding why the rules exist. Slytherins do not seek dangerous magic to embrace darkness. They approach it like scholars handling fire, with respect for its heat, its destruction, and its potential to illuminate. Their strength lies not in the spells they cast, but in their knowledge of limits, where power holds, where it fractures, and where it becomes something no wizard should wield. Yet the shadow of Slytherin's legacy, the dark movements, cannot be ignored. Voldemort's rise twisted the public perception of the house beyond recognition. His ideology was never the inheritance of Salazar, but the corruption of one principle, that power must be used responsibly. Voldemort replaced responsibility with domination, caution with absolutism, and in doing so, he pulled many Slytherins into his orbit, some willingly, seduced by the promise of order and strength, others through fear, manipulation, or social pressure. But history rarely speaks of the Slytherins who opposed him, those who infiltrated his ranks as spies, who sheltered Muggleborns in silence, who refuse to let their house be defined by a tyrant. Their stories remain quieter, overshadowed by the spectacle of Voldemort's brutality. This duality, the brilliance and the brutality, forms the essence of Slytherin's relationship with power. Its bright face reveals leaders, innovators, scholars, and reformists. Its dark face reveals manipulators, extremists, and those who mistake ambition for destiny. And so Slytherin stands as a house of possibility, neither inherently noble nor inherently corrupt. It does not create evil, it creates influence, and influence in the hands of the wise becomes legacy, but in the hands of the reckless becomes ruin. In the end, the question is not what Slytherin produces, but what each Slytherin chooses to become. When tracing the lineage of Slytherin House across 1,000 years, the transformation is not linear, but cyclical, expanding, contracting, reshaping itself as the wizarding world changes around it. Slytherin is not a static monument. It is a living organism, adapting to the pressures of history while preserving the echoes of its founders' ideals. To understand its evolution is to read the shifting tides of magical society itself. The first era, the clanship era of the 10th to 15th centuries, was closest to Salazar Slytherin's original intent. Hogwarts was young then, the world beyond its walls violent and unpredictable. In this period, students sorted into Slytherin formed something resembling a clan, united not by lineage, but by shared ideology. They valued survival, discernment, and the ability to navigate danger with intelligence rather than brute force. Slytherin House was a crucible for strategists, teaching that leadership required caution, adaptability, and a willingness to make difficult decisions. To belong to Slytherin during this time was to step into a brotherhood of thinkers who viewed the world through the lens of resilience and foresight. But as the centuries turned, the nobility era emerged. Spanning the 16th to 19th centuries, the wizarding world began to stabilize, and with stability came hierarchy. Old families, enriched by generations of magical influence, rose to prominence. Slytherin, with its symbolism of power and refinement, became the preferred house of the aristocracy. To be sorted into Slytherin was no longer simply a recognition of one's inner qualities. It became a social declaration. The house grew entwined with notions of prestige and purity, not because Salazar demanded it, but because the ruling families of the age reshaped his doctrines to reinforce their authority. This reinterpretation twisted the concept of selectivity into exclusivity, turning a philosophy of responsibility into a justification for elitism. Slytherin's halls grew quieter, more rigid. Its members were scrutinized as potential heirs to family legacies, rather than as individuals forging their own paths. Ambition was still nurtured, but it took on a colder edge, sharpened by expectation and pedigree. The house became, in many ways, a mirror of wizarding nobility, and its image grew increasingly opaque. Then came the controversial era of the 20th century, when Voldemort's rise and ideology cast a long, corrosive shadow over Slytherin's name. The association between the house and dark magic became nearly absolute in public perception. Nuance vanished. The world eager for simplified narratives reduced Slytherin to a symbol of fear. Students who bore its colors were met with suspicion, despite many having no connection to Voldemort's beliefs. Those who resisted him were overshadowed by the louder, more sensational tale of the Dark Lord. Slytherin became not a house, but an accusation, Yet through all these eras, clan, nobility, controversy, the house retained its original duality. It continued to produce figures of immense capability, heroes and innovators, tyrants and visionaries. Slytherin did not change because it was inconsistent. It changed because the world around it kept rewriting the definition of power. Slytherin endures as a fluctuating symbol, sometimes revered, sometimes reviled, but always central to the story of magic itself. For better or worse, it is a house shaped by the times, and a house that in turn shapes the times around it. To speak of Slytherin is to speak of contradiction, of a house shaped by forces that elevate and endanger it in equal measure. Few houses in Hogwarts embody a paradox so clearly, a legacy where the light and shadow are not opposites, but reflections of the same source. And to understand that paradox, we must explore the forces that shaped Slytherin from within. At the core lies ambition, the trait for which Slytherin is most known and most misunderstood. Ambition is the spark that drives witches and wizards to transcend the ordinary, to build, to innovate, to lead. It is the force that turns potential into legacy. In this, Slytherin is unmatched. The house produces leaders, not by accident, but by design. Yet the very trait that makes its students extraordinary can also unravel them. When ambition loses its sense of direction, when it ceases to be a tool and becomes a hunger, it mutates into something volatile. A gift that should guide becomes a fire that consumes. Slytherin's greatest strength is also its greatest vulnerability. Then there is the doctrine of selectivity, often twisted across time. In its earliest form, it was a protective measure, a belief that magical knowledge, especially in an age of persecution, should be entrusted to those mature enough to wield it responsibly. But as centuries passed, the doctrine was misread, repurposed, and reinterpreted. What began as a call for caution became, in the public mind, a banner of exclusion. Slytherin was judged not by its intentions, but by the stories built around it. The world chose the narrative it preferred, and the house became the symbol of prejudice it never intended to be. Another part of the paradox lies in adaptability, a defining trait of Slytherin approach. Unlike other houses, Slytherin does not bind itself to rigid ideals. It bends, shifts, and recalibrates with each generation. This flexibility allows Slytherins to thrive in turbulent times, navigating political storms and social upheavals with remarkable precision. But adaptability, when misdirected, can become a liability. It can pull individuals toward movements that promise power, stability, or control, even at the cost of moral clarity. In the wrong moment, adaptability becomes alignment, and alignment becomes danger. And woven through all of this is Slytherin's profoundly complex relationship with power. Students of this house do not fear power. They study it. They understand its structure, its language, its consequences. Power to them is neither good nor evil. It is architecture, a framework, something to be handled with both respect and skill. But the moment power ceases to be a means and becomes the end itself, the balance collapses. The pursuit shifts from purpose to possession, and biographical potential becomes tragedy. This is the ultimate paradox of Slytherin. It is the only house where becoming a hero requires walking the same path that could also make one a villain. The door is the same. The difference is in the choices made once you pass through it. To embrace the Slytherin identity is to hold a blade by its edge, one that can carve out greatness or draw blood. And the house does not determine which outcome prevails. The individual does, through discipline, through intention, through the quiet courage to direct ambition rather than be directed by it. In that choice lies the true legacy of Slytherin, a legacy shaped not by darkness or light, but by the thin, perilous line between them. To understand Slytherin is to understand its symbols, for the house communicates through imagery as much as through philosophy. Its identity is woven from ancient motifs: serpents, water, cold light, and the quiet pressure of the deep. And these elements shape not only the house's reputation, but the very temperament of those who grow within it. At the center of this symbolic landscape stands the serpent, often misunderstood, often maligned. But long before wizards feared the basilisk or whispered about Parseltongue, the serpent was a universal emblem of rebirth. It sheds its skin, emerges renewed, and adapts without hesitation. It embodies wisdom, subtlety, and the ability to strike only when necessary. These qualities reveal the heart of Slytherin more honestly than any rumor could. The house values transformation, resilience, and a quiet form of strength that does not require spectacle to be felt. Parseltongue, too, is part of this lineage, not a curse but a relic of ancient magical civilizations, where communication with serpents was seen as a bridge to deeper natural forces. It is not the language of darkness, but the language of old magic, spoken in frequencies that resonate with the hidden layers of the world. For Slytherins, Parseltongue symbolizes a connection to forgotten knowledge, the kind carried in bloodlines and echoes. The house colors green and silver extend this identity. Green, the color of still water and deep forests, represents secrecy, depth, and calm under pressure. It is the color of insight, not intimidation. Silver, cool and reflective, symbolizes clarity of mind and sharpness of thought. When placed together, the hues form a palette of quiet intelligence, strategic, composed, and introspective. These symbols converge in the house's elemental association. Water, unlike fire, which burns openly, or air, which moves unpredictably, water conceals its strength beneath a tranquil surface. It yields, shifts, and adapts, yet over time erodes stone and reshapes landscapes. Water teaches patience, restraint, and the ability to navigate unseen currents, traits essential to Slytherin's identity. It embodies the house's belief that true power flows quietly and continuously, not with chaotic flashes. Perhaps the most vivid expression of Slytherin's symbolism is its common room beneath the Black Lake. There, the world feels suspended. The ceiling glows with the pale, wavering light filtered through the water above. Shadows ripple, silence thickens, everything moves slowly, as if time itself has adopted the rhythm of the deep. It is a place where thoughts sharpen and emotions settle. The pressure of the water creates a subtle, ever-present weight, a reminder of the discipline and control the house values. In such an environment, Slytherins learn to observe before acting. They see situations through layers, much like watching the distorted shapes beyond the lake's surface. They become comfortable with ambiguity, with choosing the right moment, with understanding that quiet is not weakness, it is calculation. This symbolic landscape shapes not only their behavior, but their magical instincts. Slytherins excel in old magics, transformative spells, protective enchantments, and defensive techniques that require patience and subtlety. They do not fear the darker aspects of magic, They study them, not to submit, but to master. Their temperament is cool, deliberate, and analytical, traits nurtured by centuries of symbolism and environment. And in the end, all these pieces point to a single truth. Slytherin's legacy is not rooted in domination or fear, but in metamorphosis. Like the serpent shedding its skin, the house survives by evolving, adapting, and understanding the hidden currents others overlook. For true power, Slytherin's power does not roar. It observes, it transforms, it waits. Let your breath slow and imagine the deep chambers beneath Hogwarts adjusting themselves, as if the old stones still listen for the truth behind every footstep. For all the stories, all the fear, all the legends surrounding Slytherin, the revelation at the heart of this house is not about darkness, it is about responsibility, and perhaps about the fragile boundary where power meets intention. Slytherin was never designed to be a sanctuary for villains, nor a pipeline toward corruption. It was built as a reminder, a warning etched into the architecture of the magical world. Power itself is neutral. It does not create evil. It does not create good. It amplifies what already lives inside the one who wields it. If a heart is noble, power will help it shape civilizations. But if a heart is fractured, hungry, or untethered, power will not mend it. It will magnify the break. This is the truth history often forgets, buried under sensational tales. Slytherin is not the birthplace of malevolence. It is the house that forces its students to confront themselves. Ambition is the crucible, strategy is the fire, and each witch or wizard who walks through those green, low-lit corridors must eventually face the question that defines the house entirely. What will you become once power is within reach? For some, Slytherin becomes a forge that tempers leadership. These are the ones who emerge with clarity, individuals who understand that power is a tool, not a throne. They rise quietly through influence rather than force, shaping laws, protecting fragile systems, studying ancient magic with reverence rather than greed. Their ambition becomes purpose, their cunning becomes foresight, and their legacy becomes protection rather than domination. But others lose their way. Ambition without direction becomes hunger, caution becomes paranoia, and the capacity to influence becomes the temptation to control. These are the Slytherins history remembers most loudly, the ones who let their shadows outrun their intentions. Yet even they are reflections of the same truth. Slytherin does not create monsters. It reveals the cracks that were already there. In the end, the legacy of Salazar Slytherin is not held in the basilisk sleeping beneath the school, nor in the hidden tunnels winding like veins through ancient stone. It is not sealed inside heirlooms or bloodlines. His true legacy lies in a question he whispered across centuries, a question far more profound than any spell he ever cast. Who is worthy of power? Not in the sense of lineage, not in the sense of purity, but in the sense of character. For Slytherin understood what few others dared to acknowledge. The greatest danger in magic is not the spell, but the intention behind the hand that casts it. So when we look at the house, its triumphs, its tragedies, its brilliant minds, and its broken ones, we see the same pattern repeated. Slytherin is a mirror, clearer, sharper, less forgiving, and in its reflection lies the climax of its philosophy. This house does not shape destiny, It asks you to choose it. As we drift toward the end of this journey, Slytherin reveals itself not as a darkness, but as a paradox, protective yet divisive, capable of shaping brilliance as easily as it awakens danger. And if the serpent symbolizes rebirth, perhaps the house is shedding its skin once more, transforming from a misunderstood relic into a sanctuary for strategy, wisdom, and leadership. So pause, breathe, and let the soft green glow beneath the lake whisper its quiet history. But remember, the path of ambition is always unfolding, and waiting for the one brave enough to walk it.